Hi, everybody. This is Danya Krishnamurthy, Feature PM, working on the hybrid platform in Azure Identity at Microsoft.
And I'm Daniel Birmingham, a program manager on the customer experience team.
Thank you for joining a session on how to accelerate your hybrid identity journey with Azure Active Directory and how Microsoft's hybrid platform can help you achieve seamless collaboration and productivity for your identity and access management needs. Whether you're starting your journey with Azure Identity and looking to understand how your hybrid setup is going to look, or if you're trying to optimize your existing hybrid setup because of your ever-changing business needs, we hope that this session provides some answers for you. In this session, we'll cover provisioning scenarios of varying complexity, from a simple Office 365 tenant setup to a multi-tenant setup. We'll show you how you can consolidate all your identities from your various on-prem tenants, connected or disconnected, to a single global Azure AD tenant. We will deep dive into Azure AD Connect cloud provisioning feature and how it helps you achieve your hybrid needs as you move your organization to the cloud. And of course, we'll have demos, tons of them. So without further ado, let's begin. Identity provisioning provides you with a single platform that can meet all your hybrid identity requirements. HR-driven provisioning enables automation of the human resources and identity lifecycle management scenarios such as new hires, management of employee attributes, and employee terminations. We have rich integration with user provisioning workflows of Workday and SuccessFactors. Directory provisioning automates the process of provisioning objects such as users, devices, groups from AD to Azure AD, keeping the directories in sync and allowing you to leverage existing processes already in place using on-prem solutions. Not only can you automate object creation using directory provisioning, you can also provisioning authentication details or authentication credentials. As an example, you could use password hash sync so that the authentication can happen directly in Azure AD using the same password as on-prem without having to send the user back to AD. App provisioning lets you automatically provision user access to their applications and automatically revoke access when it's not needed anymore. Choose from over 130 pre-integrated applications or bring your own SCIM-compliant application. In addition to provisioning to on-prem apps, we are going to start support for provisioning to applications on-prem using user stores such as SQL or LDAP. This feature is currently in private preview for the on-prem provisioning scenario, and we are looking towards a public preview. So keep your eye out for updates and announcements in this space. I want to briefly touch on directory provisioning. Directory provisioning today can be done using multiple tools like Microsoft Identity Manager, also known as MEM, Azure AD Connect Sync, and Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning. Each of these tools was built to address different needs, scenarios, and use cases, which I'll cover now. Microsoft Identity Manager, our longest-lived provisioning product, was originally built to address the on-premises needs. These include provisioning from an on-prem HR system to Active Directory and from Active Directory to on-prem applications. Although it can be used to provision objects to Azure AD using the Microsoft Graph Connector, this is not something we recommend. MIM was not built for that, because of which it has very limited support for hybrid scenarios available in Azure AD as well. Azure AD Connect Sync, which you may also have known as DIR Sync or AD Sync in its previous life, was the first solution built for provisioning from AD to AD. It currently has support for most Azure AD hybrid scenarios, and it can support companies with very large directories. While Connect Sync is very robust in its capabilities, it also requires heavy investment from an infrastructure perspective. It all is configuration or managed on-prem, thereby resulting in higher maintenance cost. While it is currently the most utilized provisioning solution, and it is very useful to many of our customers, we felt that we needed to build something that's more cloud-driven, that requires less of an investment for our customers and quicker to deploy and support. Which brings us to our next tool, Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning. Azure AD Cloud Provisioning leverages a lightweight agent or set of agents that you install on-prem while managing all your provisioning configuration from the cloud. It has support for all common Azure AD hybrid scenarios, while also extending its support for what we call as disconnected forest scenario that's commonly seen in mergers and acquisitions. Due to its smaller footprint on-prem, and high availability features, it makes your hybrid setup super easy to manage, as well as it provides resiliency for your infrastructure. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Daniel, who will be walking you through why cloud provisioning might be the right solution for you. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Danya. First, we'll cover some of the major benefits of choosing Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning as your provisioning tool, and then discuss two common scenarios that we frequently encounter when working with our customers to illustrate how these benefits apply to them. One of the major reasons you'll want to consider choosing cloud provisioning over the other tools are the cost savings. With cloud provisioning leveraging a lightweight agent, you no longer need to deploy a robust server in your data center to run the service. And unlike Azure AD Connect Sync that requires SQL Server for larger deployments, that is not the case with cloud provisioning, so you may be able to save money on SQL Server licensing too. Along with infrastructure savings, you'll find yourself spending less on support and maintenance throughout the life of the service due to its simplified architecture. Our upcoming demo will show cloud provisioning is extremely quick to deploy and simple to configure, so you can get it up and running in your environment in a fraction of the time spent deploying the other options. The simple setup is intuitive and streamlined so that you can enable your end users to start collaborating quickly and seamlessly with minimal effort. Multiple agents can be deployed in your environment to provide high availability and automatic failover, preventing a service outage due to a server or network failure. This will help prevent frustrations for your end users and will reduce support calls for things like unprovisioned users or out-of-date group memberships. And if you find yourself needing to provision for multiple Active Directory forests that have no network connectivity between them, as we see in complex scenarios like mergers and acquisitions, you'll find that this is your solution. Cloud provisioning allows you to deploy agents into each of the isolated networks that can communicate independently between the forest and the respective network and Azure AD. If you already have Azure AD Connect Sync deployed in your environment, not to worry. That does not exclude you from deploying cloud provisioning to that same environment as well. Cloud provisioning can be used side by side with Azure AD Connect Sync. It can even be used to provision from the same directory, which is an important capability for migrating from one tool to the other. We also see a lot of customers like SMBC and Emmy that use Azure AD Connect Sync for their main AD forest while using cloud provisioning for their secondary or subsidiary forests. And lastly, cloud provisioning can keep Azure AD up to date with greater frequency, so no more having to wait 30 minutes for on-prem changes to be seen in Azure AD as you have to do with Azure AD Connect Sync. Based on these benefits of the cloud provisioning feature, we recommend that for any new deployment, upgrade, or AD expansion, that you first consider if cloud provisioning is the right tool for the job. Next, I want to illustrate why cloud provisioning is the right tool for two quite different scenarios that we encounter on the customer experience team. In the first scenario, we have F128, your typical small to medium-sized business. F128 is just starting their cloud journey into Azure and Office 365. They have a single Active Directory forest that has been providing identities to their on-premises ecosystem for years. This is Evan, the systems administrator that has been tasked with creating a bridge between their on-prem AD domain and Azure AD. Being a smaller company, Evan wears many hats, so he does not have the luxury of becoming a provisioning expert to get connected to the cloud. After researching the various options, he finds the following is most appealing about cloud provisioning. First, it's cost effective. The lightweight agent design allows Evan to work with the limited resources he has at his disposal. Asking for an expensive, beefy server for the task is just not an option. Next, it's quick to deploy. IT is getting pressure from leadership to start leveraging their investment in Office 365, and that means deploying a hybrid configuration quickly. Finally, it's simple and intuitive configuration. Having to wear so many hats means that he does not have much time to spend on any one thing. He will be responsible for managing the configuration for the long term, so he needs something that is easy to learn and maintain. As mentioned earlier, cloud provisioning is not just for net new Azure AD deployments. It can be used to integrate additional forests into a single Azure AD tenant, even when Azure AD Connect Sync is already deployed. In this next scenario, Charlie, who's an identity architect at F128 Photo, is in charge of quickly integrating a newly purchased print company into their Azure AD tenant, so that the companies can quickly start collaborating seamlessly in teams, and the new employees can start accessing the enterprise applications which are integrated into Azure AD. Print is a traditional on-prem shop, so they do not have an Azure AD tenant of their own. And with the purchase only being a few days old, there is still no network connectivity between the two companies, so leveraging Azure AD Connect Sync is not an option. What makes cloud provisioning the best choice for Charlie is that it supports coexistence with Azure AD Connect Sync, so she does not have to make any changes to their existing provisioning tool, she can just add to it. Second, it can provision from disconnected forests that allows her to move forward immediately without waiting for networking to provide line of sight between the environments, which may take several weeks or longer. And finally, high availability with automatic failover. Because she prefers not to be called in to work on the weekends, she plans on deploying multiple cloud provisioning agents so the service is still up and running if one of the agents fails. Although quite different scenarios, both Evan and Charlie will follow very similar steps to deploy cloud provisioning in their environment. Up next, we will demo the steps that they will likely take. For our first demo, we will be walking through the Cloud Provisioning Agent installation and basic configuration process. Similar to Azure AD Connect Sync, this server and any other agent server should be secured like a domain controller, or what we call a Tier 0 asset from the administrative tier model. The first step will be to launch Edge and navigate to the Azure AD Management Portal. I will be logging in as a hybrid identity administrator, but you can also log in as a global administrator to complete the next steps. The hybrid identity administrator role was added so that you can delegate the deployment and configuration of cloud provisioning to individuals that are not assigned the global admin role. Once logged in, I will navigate to the cloud provisioning page by first clicking on Azure AD Connect and then the Manage Provisioning link. Next, I'll download the agent, which requires acceptance of the terms of use. Once the agent installer executable is downloaded, I'll open the file to launch the installer. I'll agree to the license terms and privacy notice and start the installation. The installer will install the agent binaries and agent service, which will run as a virtual service account. The agent configuration wizard is automatically launched and prompts me to log into Azure AD, which I'll do using the hybrid identity administrator account. An authentication token is obtained from Azure AD, which will be used during the registration process. I am then asked to confirm the domain configuration. At this point, the agent registration process begins. It starts by creating a certificate that the agent will use to authenticate to Azure AD in the future. It uses the authentication token obtained earlier to register the agent and domain information, as well as the certificate. Next, it restarts the agent service. During the agent restart, it checks for configuration updates in Azure AD and continues to check for updates every 10 minutes while running. At this point, the agent is successfully installed, and now it is time for basic configuration of the cloud provisioning service. Back in the Azure AD Management Portal, I can see the agent is registered. I will now create a configuration for the f128.local domain. I'm going to use password hashing as the authentication method for my provision users, so I'll leave it enabled here. This will make my journey to the cloud much easier, as I won't have to worry about setting up a federation service in my on-prem environment. It will also give me leak credential detection and authentication resiliency in the event my on-prem Active Directory becomes unavailable. Once the configuration is created, I will define an OU-based scoping filter so that only the appropriate users, groups, and contact objects are provisioned to Azure AD. At this point, the basic configuration is complete. Danya will now demo some of the new capabilities that you may want to consider using when finishing out the configuration.
Daniel showed you how to do basic configuration, including setting up scoping filters and password hash sync. I'm going to be covering two features today, which will be public previewed soon. One is the attribute mapping. The other one is what we call as provision a user or provision on demand. The attribute mapping experience exists today in the form of MS Graph API, which you could use programmatically. We are adding a user experience on top of it to make it easy for you to apply these transformations. The second feature, provision a user, is a feature that will help you test a user with your existing configuration before you go and roll it out for your entire organization. We highly recommend using this feature because it gives you a step-by-step guidance on whether your scoping filter is set as expected and whether your transformation works as expected. So this way, if you want to make any kind of adjustments, you do it in this step make sure everything looks good with a few users, and then you can roll it out to your entire organization. Now, let's jump into the demo. This is the attribute mapping page. As you can see, we have three tabs at the top for users, groups, and contacts. So you can actually go and set attribute transformation for each of these object types. When you click on groups, you'll be able to see all the group attributes. And when you click on contacts, you'll be able to see all the contact attributes. This way, you can easily delineate the different object types and its attributes. Now let's jump to an example. I'm going to use display name, which is very common to standardize in the real world, especially when you're moving users from multiple on-prem tenants into a single Azure AD tenant. In this example, you see that display name is a direct mapping and is associated with a common name in the source attribute, which is AD here. What I'm going to do now is I want to actually go ahead and change it into an expression where I want to append the physical delivery office address to the display name. You can see that expression here. I've appended it and I've joined it with the common name. Once I do that, I click apply, and you can see that my change is at the top, but it's still not saved. I have to go and click on the save schema in order for this transformation to apply when you're syncing the user. So I go ahead and save the schema here, and as you can see in the notification area, the save is in progress. Once the save is successful, you will be taken back to the configuration page. Now we are going to provision a user. I'm going to take a user here and I want to test this user to see whether the transformation I just applied actually works. So in my example, I'm picking a user with a distinguished name. I'm picking the distinguished name of the user. I'm going to use this example here, and then I'm going to start provisioning. When I click provision, there are 4 steps that happen. You check whether the user exists in AD, then you check to see whether they are within the scope of what you have set, and then you check to see if they already exist in Azure AD and whether you have to match any attributes. And finally, you tell whether the user was successfully synced or not. Each of these steps has details that you can go in and look at. As an example, if you go into the import user and click on the view details, you will be able to see all the attributes that this particular user had in AD. And from there, you can go to the check whether the user in scope. And we do a certain bit of check here to see whether the scoping filter evaluation passed, whether the user has the required role, and whether they are active in the system. Then we go and match this user with Azure AD. In this case, it's a create experience, so we don't need to do any kind of matching. So we just tell you that we're going to create this user. And finally, we show you how this user object information will look in Azure AD. And as you can see there, his name has the physical office address name. Now we have successfully provisioned this user. You can either go ahead and provision another user, or you can click on finish to go back to your configuration. The final steps in the configuration includes adding a notification email in order to send any kind of sync error notifications, or if your particular provision configuration goes into quarantine. So you take an admin email or a hybrid admin email and put that in there. And then the final step here is to enable deployment and click on the save configuration in order to initiate the sync for all the users in your scoping filter. That brings us to the end of our demo session. You saw how easy it was to set up cloud provisioning in your environment. We have a couple of our customers who has given testimonials on how they use cloud provisioning and how it helped them achieve their business needs. Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, known as SMBC, is one of the biggest banks in Japan. It has about 50,000 employees all over the world. SMBC has 2 main Office 365 tenants, one for Japan and APAC and one for US. Since SMBC is the big financial conglomerate, it has a lot of mergers and acquisitions. This has led to many disconnected forests, thereby making it very hard for them to manage a global tenant in Azure AD. They started using cloud provisioning about a year back, and so far SMBC has consolidated user accounts from across 200 disconnected forests into a single Azure AD tenant using Office 365 in Japan and US regions. Tom Sawyer, the vice president of the cloud architecture team at SMBC, had this to say. I'm going to ask you to pause your video and take a read through it. I just wanted to call out the 2 things that stood out for me at least. The single unified Azure AD which gives you the full power of Office 365, as well as the efficiency and speed in which you could set up complex topologies using cloud provisioning. Our next customer is EMI Group. EMI is a major Swiss milk processor. The company dates back to 1907 and have global presence over 14 countries. Two-thirds of more than 8,000 employees are currently based outside of Switzerland, though, and this has led to disconnected forests for them and making it hard for the employees to collaborate using Office 365. Amy started using cloud provisioning a few months back and so far consolidated user accounts from two subsidiaries into one single Azure AD tenant. This has worked really well for Amy, and they're planning to consolidate the rest of these subsidiaries over the next year. Martin Muller, system architect from Amy Group, had this to say. Again, I'm going to ask you to pause your video and read through this. The one thing again that stood out for me was the single Azure AD global tenant that gives you the full power of Office 365 and also helping you in centralizing IAM and M365. Now I'm going to switch gears to feature capabilities. What do we have today and what our roadmap looks like? Most of what you have today is what you saw as part of a demo. One additional feature that I do want to call out here is the availability of a new role called Hybrid Identity Administrator. With this role, you no longer need to be a global admin in order to set up provisioning configuration or do any kind of sync operations. This feature was released a few months back, and you could use it today in order to move away from the global admin role. As for our product roadmap, what does it look like? So we're going to have a public preview refresh in a few weeks with whatever we demoed in this session. In addition to what we showed you, we are going to provide you with an improved troubleshooting experience as well as accidental deletes prevention. For general availability, which we are targeting by end of calendar year, we are hoping to give you more features specifically around synchronization of up to 150K AD objects, GMSA support for agent install, and performance improvements over the initial sync cycle. Please look forward to announcements from each of these releases in the next few months. This brings us to the end of our session. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a better understanding of how cloud provisioning can help accelerate your hybrid identity journey. Before we sign off, we need your voice in enhancing our feature. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a 1-minute survey to tell us what you would like to see happening with cloud provisioning in the future. Thank you once again for joining us. Until next time.